Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. So glad you could join us from wherever you are. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good day, everyone. And very much a welcome to this webinar on ZacTax, delivering climate reparations through global tax justice. My name is Sarah Bach. I'm a minister of the United Methodist Church in Switzerland, and I'm part of the commission of the Commission on Climate Justice and Sustainable Development of the World Council of Churches. This commission was called for at the last assembly of the WCC in Karlsruhe and has taken up its work at the beginning of this year. As a commission, we are trying to support the already existing work of the WCC in these topics, as well as together with the various staff members, bring this work into the future, make sure we do everything we can to have WCC be a reliable and forward-thinking partner and player when it comes to climate justice. So today with this webinar, we're focusing on the economic side of that work towards climate justice. And in particular, we are looking towards the topic of tax justice. The emission of wealthy countries, corporations, and affluent people, mainly in the global north, are overwhelmingly responsible for the global climate crisis, which is hurting the poorest the most. So how can taxation and tax measures check the emissions of the super rich and address the question of who pays for climate damages? And why is this not only an ethical and moral, but also a theological issue? These are just some of the questions we're trying to answer today with this webinar. The issue of tax justice has gathered a lot more attention over the last couple of years, with it being heralded as a massive prospective contributor to social justice in general. Whereas it is still often only discussed within economic forums, we would like to broaden the discussion with this webinar. Our guiding questions will be, what is tax justice? And why can it not be ignored when talking and thinking about climate justice? Do we have theological resources we can contribute to the discussion? And what are some concrete next steps towards tax justice that can happen and need to happen, for instance, at COP29, which is coming up in just a few weeks? To help us understand this issue, we have invited 4 people to speak to us today. We will hear a short introduction on climate reparations, then we'll have a keynote on tax justice, and afterwards we'll have 2 responsive from a theological viewpoint. Thank you very much for all the presenters who are so willing to give us their time and their expertise and share some of their insights with us. We will then have a Q&A time where you can also ask your questions. So I invite you to, if you already have any questions that arise during one of these talks, introductions, or responses, write them down somewhere or write them already in the chat or the Q&A section, and then we can ask them to our presenters later on. I am now very grateful to introduce to you the first person who will speak to us. I want to introduce to you Patricia Munkal from the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. She is also part of ACT Alliance, a global faith-based coalition who works on humanitarian aid, gender and climate justice, migration and displacement, and peace and security to support local communities. She is going to give us an introduction into the topic and help us understand why climate reparations are such an important tool when it comes to climate justice. Thank you very much, Patricia, and you have 5 minutes.
Yes. Thank you, Reverend Sarah. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
All right, thank you. We are living with loss and damage for every single day that we live. We are breathing loss and damage and seeing it in the waves, seeing it in the skies, feeling it in the food that we eat. These are the words of Jenna, a young girl from the island of Bohol. Bohol Island is a small island community. Is composed of small island communities facing the Pacific. It is located in the middle or central part of the Philippines. Another person that I was able to talk to this year was a farmer from a separate province. I didn't get to write down his name, but the province was from Negros Occidental. He is a sugar farmer working in a plantation. He said that the severe drought caused by El Nino has affected our livelihood severely. Of course, if we have our water system here, it would help the farmers, but ultimately, it would help our landlords. Good day, good evening, everyone. I am Patricia Mungkal from the National Council of Churches in the Philippines, and I've been working in the Humanitarian Response Program of NCCP for 8 years already. And I have been exposed to disaster risk reduction, part of our work, to climate change adaptation, and right now to emergency response aspect. So that's why I had the privilege to talk to these people who are on the ground. So let me tell you what it looks like on the ground and how climate justice is really about social justice. Right now, just in our program, and of course, more importantly, the communities affected by the climate crisis, we are struggling to recover from one disaster to another. Just this year, we have faced severe drought brought by El Nino. It is one of the longest droughts in the recent years, lasting from 8 to 10 months, and was followed by extreme typhoons, extreme storms. So even before we had a chance to recover from that severe drought, from that scorching season, we are trying now to recover from the wettest, strongest typhoons that we have experienced. And that is the case from the provinces, from the rural communities to the center of the Philippines, Metro Manila. We are experiencing, it is not a matter of the experiences from the urban or rural, because we are already feeling it wherever we go. And this is year-round already. And as a young person myself, I have to remind myself that this is not normal, that we may grow up in decades that this has become normalized, but this is not normal. And what's striking about this is that when the climate crisis hits, it is the most vulnerable sectors, most marginalized sectors too, like the farmers, fishers, the indigenous people, and those living from the small island communities who are, of course, bearing the heaviest brunt of the climate crisis. And this is on top, of course, this exists in the backdrop of economic injustices. Just like the farmer from the sugar farmer from Negros Occidental, he is a sugar farmer working in a sugar plantation, suffering for a big corporate plantation producing sugar and crops. And that is the case for tobacco farmers. That is the case also for fisher folks in our coastal areas being threatened to be displaced. And of course, in our conversations right now, about the climate crisis, about climate reparations, we cannot be too technical about this. We need to feel it, we need to feel, we need to smell, we need to see what is happening on the ground. Loss and damage is local, so adaptation should be local. The question is, where should the support come from? If this climate injustice is born from economic injustices and social structures that are unjust, that are unfair for the people, where should the support come from? And with that, we have in those realities that we are facing on the ground, I have come to a conclusion that when we talk about, or when we start to talk about climate reparations, it should be in the context of justice, of course. It should be in the context of justice for the grassroots who are being affected by the climate crisis first. It should also be in the context of accountability from the national level to international levels. Accountability for the accountability from the polluters who have driven the climate crisis. And of course, it is also, the topic of climate reparations should also be in the essence or in line with the essence of international cooperation. We are not just mere recipients of reparations. We are active players as well, even though we are the first ones being affected. We could also do something about it. But at the same time, we know where to get those accountability from. The polluters, the corporations, the nations who have driven this climate crisis. Therefore, whether we are from the global south, whether we are from the global north, there should be global south and south-to-south cooperation. There should be south and south solidarity, global north and south solidarity and cooperation as well, and of course, accountability from the polluters. How do we make them pay for the damages that they have incurred through the climate crisis? So I will just end with a few calls. First is people, planet over profit. We should put the people and the planet over profit. And second is climate justice is peace. If peace means food on the table, if it means shelter and livelihood for everyone, then climate justice is peace. Again, people, planet over profit, climate justice is peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for giving us, helping us listen to some of these grounded voices from the Philippines and your own voice, and helping us to understand that while the loss and damage is local and the support should be local, the solidarity and the cooperations, they need to be worldwide, they need to be international, and that climate reparations can be a part of helping that to come to fruition. Thank you very much. Following this, we can now delve deeper into the topic of tax justice and why tax justice can deliver climate reparations and how the UN Tax Convention can respond to these issues. Please welcome with me our keynote speaker of today, Chennai Mukumba. Chennai Mukumba is the Executive Director at the Tax Justice Network Africa. She is based in Nairobi, Kenya, and overall provides strategic leadership and direction to deliver on TJNA's mission and vision in its various thematic areas. Janai has a master's in international relations from Wits University in Johannesburg and is currently studying for a master's in taxation at the University of Oxford. Thank you very much for sharing your insight with us, Janai. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who is on the call. First of all, a huge thank you for the invitation to be able to speak today. Us at TJNA really honor and treasure the opportunities that we have to share about some of the work that we do. So today, one of the things that I hope to do is to discuss an issue that lies at the intersection of what we think are some of the most pressing challenges of our time, specifically climate change and economic justice. And my focus today is going to be on the critical role that specifically tax justice, which is a branch of the broader economic justice work, can play in delivering climate reparations that was so eloquently spoken about a few minutes ago. And then more specifically, how the proposed UN tax convention, something that we are so incredibly excited about at TJNA, how that offers us an incredible and unique opportunity to address some of these interconnected issues. So I'll begin with the need for climate reparations. Some of this has already been spoken about by the previous speaker, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I'm going to just emphasize and double click on a few points. So the first is, let's acknowledge the context, right? Climate change is not a phenomenon that's affecting everyone equally. It's being felt most acutely, most significantly by those who have contributed the least to this problem: low-income countries, marginalized communities, but much more specifically, marginalized communities in low-income countries. The nations that face the brunt of this particular situation, specifically rising sea levels, food insecurity, water insecurity, are the ones that are being asked to bear a burden for which they themselves are not responsible. Whilst the wealthiest countries, corporations, and individuals, those that have historically and continuously today contribute the most to greenhouse gas emissions, continue to profit. So this inequity that I've just spoken about now demands a solution. One that not only addresses this environmental crisis, but also redresses the developmental crisis, right? The economic and social injustices that underlie what we're talking about today. And this is where the conversation about climate reparations comes into play, right? So climate reparations is a conversation about how to involve financial compensation to those that are being most affected by climate change, right? Funded by those that are most responsible for causing it. So why tax justice? That is the question that I've been asked to speak to, right? Why is tax justice the right mechanism to deliver these reparations? And I believe there's 4 compelling reasons that I'm going to speak to during my address. The first is addressing historical responsibility. So tax justice provides us with a framework through which we can hold those that are most responsible, the ones that I've just been speaking about now, to be held accountable for what we're seeing with response to climate change. Essentially, it provides us with a framework to ensure that wealthy nations and corporations recognize that they number one, owe a debt, not just financially, but also to the planet. And they owe a debt to those that I just mentioned are the ones that are really on the receiving end of this. And so tax justice allows us to impose financial obligations on those entities and individuals based on the historical and continued contribution to climate degradation. In other words, it allows us to ensure that those who have caused the problems are those that are paying to solve it, right? The climate justice essentially is this idea, this concept that those who earn the most, and as I mentioned, are subsequently the biggest contributors to this problem, are those that pay the most, right, with regards to addressing it. The second reason that tax justice needs to be part of this conversation is because one of the functions of tax justice specifically, is the redistribution of wealth. The wealth gap that currently exists between nations is one of those that's also starkly reflected in their ability to respond to climate change, right? So low-income countries are those that are right now most vulnerable, yet they have the fewest financial resources to address it. So tax justice allows us to put in place what's necessary to help rectify this imbalance by redistributing this global wealth, right? And so through mechanisms like progressive wealth taxes, right, or international solidarity levies, essentially these are resources that can be generated and then have them funded towards those that are most in need, right? And so one of the things we really need to keep in mind as a pillar to this work is redistribution, and see it as essential, right, for the building of resilience as well as the adaptation capacity that's required in most vulnerable nations. The third reason that tax justice is such an important part of this conversation is because it also speaks to closing some of the loopholes and avoidance schemes that many of these multinational corporations and wealthy individuals employ in order to avoid paying their fair share, and often in the countries, right, where they are actually generating that wealth themselves. Currently, we live in an ecosystem, in a situation where multinational corporations, individuals are able to shift profits from where they are generating it to low tax jurisdictions, avoiding the taxes that could otherwise fund climate reparations, right? And so sometimes what we see is these corporations are generating wealth in regions that are being most negatively affected, and then shifting that wealth to a low tax jurisdiction, undermining the government's ability, right, where that wealth was generated, to respond, right? So there's two things here. We're trying to create a situation that I spoke to in my first 2 points, right, where wealthy corporations, wealthy individuals, wealthy companies are redirecting their wealth to where it needs to be in order to address climate change. But this third point I'm speaking to, right, is what we also need to keep in mind is ways in which the countries that are themselves being most negatively affected, right, have within their own borders their own resources that they can direct to where it needs to be. Because currently we live in a situation where those multinational corporations are shifting it out, right? And further cutting governments at their knees in terms of the resources that they need to address some of these issues, right? And so tax justice speaks to closing these loopholes, right? Ensuring that corporations are paying their fair share where their economic activities occur, as well as individuals, so that we can generate the revenue that we need, right, in order to engage in climate action, right? And so effective tax justice strategies essentially then include targeting tax havens and targeting profit shifting schemes, right? Making it possible to reclaim and retain our own revenue through addressing tax avoidance. And then the fourth point that I want to make here around tax justice and how it can speak to this question of climate change is that it's able to generate the resources that we need to fund climate adaptation and mitigation, right? Ultimately, what we want to see is that the funds that are being generated through tax justice are being directed toward essential climate adaptation and mitigation projects, right? And these are projects that are essentially supposed to begin to help us restore, right, some of the climate spaces that are being damaged, right? This is resources that we would really like to see directed towards various energy products, towards ecosystem restoration, right? And these resources being directed to those areas, as I mentioned, by those who have the means to pay, right? And if this happens, right, then we're doing a couple of things here. Right. Essentially, those that are most responsible are therefore funding within countries that are most negatively impacted a whole host of different measures that allow those countries to be increasingly resilient to the issues that they're facing, right? And so this speaks to why tax justice. Why is tax justice an important part of this question of climate reparations, right? Number one, we need to address the historical responsibility. Number two, we need to be redistributing wealth. Number three, closing loopholes and addressing avoidance schemes, right? Helps to strengthen many of the countries that are suffering these negative effects, right? And also then lastly, the resources that we're generating directed towards funding climate adaptation and mitigation is really the direct way, right, that this tax justice conversation is contributing meaningfully to that of climate reparations. Now, the second part of my conversation is how can the UN Tax Convention respond? Now, I mentioned earlier, you might have seen my excitement right at the beginning of this, right? That the UN Tax Convention is a process that's currently underway, that ourselves at Tax Justice Network Africa are beside ourselves in terms of being excited about. And the reason for this is because many of us in the tax justice movement, actually, let me correct that, not many of us, a few of us in the tax justice movement had really been advocating for this UN Tax Convention. Now there are an incredible number of people who fully support this work. But right when we began to support the calls for a UN Tax Convention, there weren't many of us, right? And it was institutions such as the Global Alliance for Tax Justice that were at the forefront and continued to spearhead and call, right, for this UN Tax Convention. And it's really in large part due to their work that we are now seeing the fruits of their labor now. And now we're able to see all of these different institutions and individuals that initially had questioned whether it was possible now come on board. The UN Tax Convention is a process by which we are trying to see the decisions that govern the global tax system be taken away from the platform where they currently exist now, which is currently governed by a few of the wealthiest countries, and shifted to a much more equitable platform where every single country can have a say with regards to the global tax rules, right? So historically, the OECD has been the platform where decisions were being made on the global tax system. And for the past 15, 20, 30, 40 years, we have been saying that this needs to shift to a much more equitable platform. And in 2022, we finally saw conversations in this direction meaningfully start to happen at the United Nations, led by the Africa Group, right? The Africa Group said, it's time now that decisions that affect all of us be made not only by those that are wealthy, that are rich, but also by those that have historically been marginalized, right? Wealth is not a normative value. Everybody needs to be able to contribute to the decision-making that affects everyone. So that's what the UN Tax Convention conversation is about, right? Shifting that power from a few countries to the space that is much more equitable so that everybody can say and contribute and discuss what those global tax, that global tax system looks like. So essentially, what we're currently now enjoying is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to create fairer, more equitable tax rules that can address some of the most important global challenges that we're facing today, including climate change, right? And I'm going to speak to a few ways that I really think the UN Tax Convention can help us respond to this most important issue of climate change. So, first and foremost, I gave a little bit of a description around the UN Tax Convention, right? So right now, we are at a stage where the terms of reference for this framework convention have been finalized and agreed. Again, a huge thank you to the Africa Group that's spearheading this process. Next year, we're actually going to start to see the beginning of the negotiations of the actual framework convention itself, right? And then once that framework convention has been agreed and decided upon, there are then going to be a number of protocols, right, that are going to be connected to this convention, where we start to speak to very specific tax issues and start to delve into the technical issues around how rules on that issue are going to look like. Now, the reason this is important is because one of the protocols that's already been proposed, and you'll see this in the terms of reference, is a protocol on environmental issues, right? So which means already in the thinking of the current negotiations, you've seen an identification by member states, right? That as we're talking about global tax systems, environmental issues are a conversation that also needs to be focused on. And this was something that was brought to the fore primarily by the small island development states, right? Because they are most affected by this, right? And tax can really play a key role, right, in addressing some of these issues. It can play a key role in a number of different ways. So one of the functions of tax, I think I spoke earlier about redistribution, is that it can also play a repricing role, right? And so essentially, when you put tax on a certain thing, it changes the price of a certain thing, and then it affects the behavior of the consumer, right? If something is expensive, you're less likely to buy it. And so the reason I'm saying this is because this is where the carbon tax conversation comes into play, right? And so this is really just a straightforward mechanism for holding high emission countries and corporations accountable, right? So by setting a standardized carbon tax at a global level, the UN Tax Convention could essentially create a space where the rules around what carbon taxes look like can be developed, right? In order to start helping us address this climate change question. And the reason this is important is because right now, just because of the urgency and the importance of climate change, there are a number of different conversations and platforms that are being created in order to think through things like carbon tax. But if you pay close attention to some of these platforms, it's just a select group of small countries that are thinking through what those could look like, right? And you'll notice that many of these platforms where these conversations are being had exclude the very same countries that are being most negatively affected by climate change, right? And so it's not to say that these platforms shouldn't be thinking about that, but ultimately the decision-making should be at a platform where even the smallest countries have a say with regards to the final outcome, right? And this is what the UN Tax Convention provides us with an opportunity to do, right? The second thing that the UN Tax Convention can help us do is essentially think through what a system of levies that reflect the principle of global solidarity could look like, right? So, for example, I mentioned, let's think about environmental taxes like carbon taxes, etc. But there are also other taxes that can be put in place that are not necessarily environmental taxes, right? But can help in the generation of funds that we need in order to address this environmental issue, right? And so this looks like, for example, financial transaction tax, right? Taxation of high net worth individuals, right? Not necessarily environmental taxes, right? But taxes that can be generated, and then those revenues directed towards climate change, right? Towards addressing these issues that I mentioned earlier, we're all struggling with at the moment. So you can imagine a scenario, right, where, for example, every international transaction tax is contributing, right, and directly being remitted, right, to where it's most needed, right? And the UN Tax Convention can help us think about that, right? Can help us think about some of those ideas. The third thing that the UN Tax Convention could also help us do is put in place more policies that are required to promote transparency and accountability in our work, right? So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that we have a system that's still allowing a number of multinational corporations and individuals avoid and pay their fair share of tax, right? Particularly in countries that you'll find are often being most negatively hit by this climate change crisis, right? And so the UN Tax Convention can think through what are some of the reporting standards that we need to strengthen or make more context specific, right? To ensure that corporations are paying their fair share of tax, right? To make sure that governments that are being most negatively hit are not being deprived of, quite frankly, their own resources, right? To help us address some of these issues, right? And so the UN Tax Convention can help us do that, right? Think through what do we need to do to improve accountability, particularly of multinational corporations, to ensure that the governments are having their own resources kept within their countries, so that they have as well their own funds to direct to the people and communities within their countries that are most in need. So those are a couple of ways, right? This UN Tax Convention can help us think through addressing climate change, and there's some really incredible people that are doing some thinking around, like I mentioned, the specific protocols on environmental taxes, right? Some thinking around, what can we do to tax the wealthiest multinational corporations, and then also lastly, what are some of the rules we need to put in place to strengthen transparency and accountability? Because right now, some of the rules that we have, whilst present, are not applicable or cannot be implemented, right, in lower income countries where the contexts are so different, right, from richer countries. And you'll find that part of the reason for that is because it was the richer countries that set the rules, right? And the context of some of these other lower-income countries wasn't taken into consideration. So that's the big UN tax convention. I mean, I've really generalized it, but I hope you get the general idea with regards to how that fits within the climate reparations conversation. I can see that I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to tie up now. I think the point I was just saying is that in conclusion, you know, the climate reparations, it's not just a matter of financial compensation, right? I think that's an important component, but much more holistically, it's a question of justice, right? Where the people who have suffered the most from climate change, right, deserve a solution that that addresses not only just the environmental issue, whilst that's important, but also helps us address the economic inequities that underpin it, right? So I mentioned earlier, there's work to shift, you know, decision-making from the OECD to the UN. What that, quite frankly, is symptomatic of, right, is a complete overhaul, right, of the global economic governance that we need to put in place, right, in order to address the systemic and structural inequalities that we currently have within the global community. So I'm going to wrap up there, and apologies for having timed out for a second, but I hope that was useful. And again, a huge thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very, very much. And I hope you could see some of the reaction that in the emojis we're putting in. You got a lot of claps and hearts when you emphasized some of the things that are happening, which are very exciting, very promising, but also I think it's going to be challenging to get that to be implemented, to have that global system of redistribution that we so clearly need. And thank you very much for highlighting that for us and give us an insight into what is happening right now on the UN level. And I think maybe we'll come back to that during the Q&A section as well. Again, so thank you very, very much, Jenai, for this talk, this keynote. So we have now invited 2 people to give their response to what we've just heard from a theological standpoint, because we as the World Council of Churches, we're also looking at how can we engage faith leaders, how can we engage churches to take part in this fight for tax justice, to join other or other communities when it comes to fighting for that UN tax convention. So first we will hear from David Montealegre about a biblical resource when it comes to tax justice. David is the Associate Secretary of Intercultural Leadership and Learning of the Canadian Council of Churches and a PhD candidate at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto in Canada. David's academic work focused on the profound intersections between economics, theology, decolonial thinking, and ethics. This academic pursuit complements his diverse practical background, which includes roles as educational consultant for WCC Global Ecumenical Theological Institute, Getty, and as the Latin American Program Director for the NGO Globe Ethics, which maybe some of you are familiar with. David is also a former GEM School student and an active member of the United Church of Canada. Thank you very much for sharing your response with us, David, in the next few minutes.
Thank you very much, Zara. I hope everyone can hear me well. And I'm very happy for this invitation. So I'm glad I can bring some of and give back some of what I've learned during all these years about these topics. And I want to start my intervention and my response acknowledging the land where I am. So as we gather together, I acknowledge and respect this sacred land of which I am now, the city of Toronto. It has been a city of human activity for 1,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. The territory was subject to the Dish Wish, One Spoon, One Pound Belt Covenant, an agreement between the 100 Anishinaabe and Anishinaabe nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are encouraged to continually strengthen our relationships among all living beings and with this land. So acknowledge this land, I want to start this theological reflection and focus on one of the questions of the description of the webinar, and that is why it is this topic a theological issue, and if we have any resource, theological resource, biblical resource to address it, and at least to reflect on it. So I will do a reflection on Zacchaeus' story from the theological perspective and its implication for theological reparations. So imagine our planet as a shared home, a beautiful big round house where every resident should have an equal stake in its well-being. Yet some inhabitants are recklessly consuming resources, leaving behind a trail of destruction, polluted air, contaminated water, depleted soils, and an atmosphere burdened with greenhouse gases. Meanwhile, the other residents, often the poorest and most vulnerable, as was mentioned before, are left to grapple with the fallout, rising sea level, swallowing their homes, extreme weather events, devastating their communities, crop failing due to unpredictable climates, and an uncertain future looming ahead. This, to me, is not a distant dystopia. It is the stark reality of our global climate crisis, as we have experienced and Patricia was telling us. So let me take you on a profound journey of theological reflection, one that challenges us to reconsider our responsibility to our planet, to each other, and ultimately to the divine. The story of Zacchaeus and his transformative encounter with Jesus offer us a powerful lens through which to examine these responsibilities. When I looked at Zacchaeus' story at first glance, it's about a chief tax collector who undergoes a remarkable moral and spiritual transformation. Moved by his encounter with Jesus, he voluntarily offers reparation to those he has wronged, pledging to give half of his possession to the poor to repay fourfold anyone he has defrauded. His actions serve as a compelling model for wealth and resources distribution to address historical injustice, paralleling the contemporary call for climate reparation to tax justice to rectify environmental injustice. But as I see it, there is something deeper going on here. The narrative of Zacchaeus intertwines taxation and theology, and these connections become even more evident and significant when framed with the concept of salvation. Yes, Zacchaeus was a tax collector who recognized his wrongdoings. However, the crux of this discussion with Jesus wasn't merely about taxes or his promises of restitution. The underlying issue was salvation. How Zacchaeus could be redeemed and realigned with the moral and spiritual community, and more critical, salvation in terms of human well-being. This is made explicit when Jesus declared at the end of the text, "Today salvation has come to this house," affirming that the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. So, for me, this story shows how deeply theology and economics are intertwined in shaping our practices and beliefs. Zacchaeus' role as tax collector wasn't just an economic function. It was entrenched in a theological framework that, at the time, justified his actions, reflecting prevailing belief about power, wealth, and social hierarchy. His belief system permitted, perhaps even encouraged him to perpetuate the inequalities and exploitation of the context where he was. So with this particular topic, I'm saying that what is behind of this behavior is a theological belief, is a belief that what we are doing, what this corporation, what this big environment and polluted organizations are doing is, for me, this story shows how deeply theory and economics are intertwined and shaping our practices and beliefs. Zacchaeus' role as a tax collector wasn't just an economic function, as I mentioned. But here is the breakthrough. Zacchaeus' decision to redistribute his wealth wasn't just an economic gesture. It was a theological shift. In my view, Zacchaeus' pledge to redistribute his wealth signifies a radical departure from the status quo, a break from the prevailing theology of his economic system, and an embrace of a new understanding that melds economic justice with spiritual redemption. It is a transformation that challenges existing structures and paves the way for a more equitable and a compassionate society. And please don't make me wrong. When I'm talking about salvation here, as you see, salvation is not these things that we expected in the future. Salvation is in terms of human being, food on the table, peace, health, etc. Now, what does this have to do with environmental reparation? As I see it, just as Zacchaeus underwent a profound reevaluation of his beliefs and actions, leading to restitution, we too must undergo a collective transformation. Our society must reassess our theological and ethical framework. And this is key, because if we don't reassess our theological and ethical framework, we will continue repeating the same thing we are criticizing. So we need to assess our ethical and theological framework concerning the environment, recognizing that care for creation is not just an ecological imperative, but a theological one that pushes us to rethink our theological bases and doctrines. For example, the doctrine of creation of the environment, a creation of everything was created by God. What does that mean? And see how they might be complicit with our contemporary climate crisis. What I have noticed is during all this year, studying this topic, is that many of our theological principles sometimes are connected with injustice. And sometimes we think that this is something from the past, that in the past, Christian theological reflection was in line with some abuses. But actually, that is not in the past. That is something that happened today. So the call for us now is to see that actually this is something that is still happening. Some of our theological inquiry, our theological thinkers are very much linked with practice of injustice, and we need to shape that. And this is what the story of Zacchaeus helps us to think. Zacchaeus' personal transformation is, to me, a reflection of the broader societal shift we desperately need in how we view and interact with the environment. It calls us to advocate for economic systems that prioritize ecological health and justice over unchecked consumption and exploitation. It urges us to acknowledge our theological and social complicity in environmental degradation and to take concrete steps toward rectifying these wrongs through mechanisms like climate reparation and global tax justice. In essence, the story of Zacchaeus challenges us to envision a new theology, one that sees the health of our planet and the well-being of all its inhabitants as intrinsically linked to our spiritual salvation. That, as I said, is not something ethereal. It's very concrete. It beckons us to act boldly and justly, redistribution resources and rectifies injustice to usher in a more equitable and just sustainable world. So as I reflect on this story, I believe Zacchaeus calls us to act. His story is not just about personal redemption. It is about how we as society can redistribute our resources and rethink our action to bring about salvation. And when I think we, I know there is some we's that are those who have been affected more than others. So this we is not everyone, because we as Christians, we have a responsibility, but among Christians, there are others we that actually are more responsible for this. And this is, I want to highlight. So we have here the opportunity to transform our economic and theological framework to ensure the well-being of our shared home and all who dwell within it. The time for changes is now. And like Zacchaeus, we have the chance to make amends. Let's not waste the time. Let me conclude with a metaphor drawing from indigenous wisdom. Imagine our world as a vast tapestry woven by the Great Spirit, where every thread represents a living being, humans, animals, plants, rivers, and mountains. In many indigenous cultures, there is a deep understanding that tugging on threads affects the entire fabric. But over time, some have pulled too hard on their threads, unraveling part of the tapestry. They have taken more than their share, leaving holes that weaken the whole. Meanwhile, those who have long honored the balance watch the tapestry phrase, knowing that its strengths come from its threads being in harmony with the others. As I see, we are at a pivotal moment, much like Zacchaeus when he climbed the sycamore tree to gain a new perspective. Perhaps it is time for us to seek higher ground, to see the bigger picture of how our action impacts the entire tapestry of life. By embracing this indigenous wisdom, we recognize that healing the tapestry requires each of us to mend the threads we have worn thin. Embracing this path, we don't just seek personal redemption. We work toward a salvation of our planet. The time for action is now. And like Zacchaeus, we have the opportunity to make amends. Let's wave a future where every thread is valued and the tapestry of life is whole once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for this reflection and for reminding us that the Zacchaeus story is not just something from the Bible, from the past, but it's something that is still happening right now all over the world, and that our spiritual transformation has implications, not just for ourselves, but also for our economy, how we handle these things, especially when it comes to working towards justice. So thank you very much for that reminder. I am now inviting our second speaker, our second responder to what we've just heard, who is Philip Peacock. Philip Vinod Peacock is the Executive Secretary for Justice and Witness at the World Communion of Reformed Churches. He's also an ordained minister of the Church of North India. Philip will now give us an insight into the process surrounding the Zacchaeus tax, a campaign of the WCC, as well as the World Communion of Reformed Churches, the Lutheran World Federation, the World Methodist Council, and the Partnership of Churches in Mission. Thank you very much, Philip, for sharing your insights with us for the next couple of minutes.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, David, as well, for framing this theologically. A hard act to follow, but I'm going to try my best to do this here. I want to divide what I'm saying into three parts. In the first part, I want to talk about the larger framework of justice. Secondly, I want to look at a specific biblical example. And thirdly, I want to look at how the Zacchaeus tax campaign actually addresses this. And I'm going to go through all three extremely quickly, so I beg your pardon if I am actually rushing through this. I want to begin by stating that within the biblical tradition, we have two words that actually speak to the question of justice. And it is kind of unfair that we separate out these two words because consistently, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, these are used together. The first word is tzedakah, and the second is mishpat. Now, both these words are translated into English as justice and righteousness, but this is perhaps not entirely a good translation. It would be the best idea to translate it actually as justice and justice again. But both of these terms, we are told, have slightly different ideas of what justice is. On the one hand, we find that mishpat refers to the law, or actually what can be spoken of as retributive justice, punitive justice that keeps or draws the guardrails around which society is actually to be framed. These are laws, perhaps, that would say that environmental protection laws that are put into place, or even to a certain extent, taxation laws. However, we know that even though we have good laws, and sometimes, of course, we don't have good laws, law is continuously subverted by dominant forces towards their own end and to actually exploit other people as well. We also know of examples where one point of time, good laws were subverted to actually support the powerful. To correct this, we have another notion of justice being indicated, and that is tzedakah, which is actually what we can call reparative or redistributive justice. And that is something that we need to speak of as well, particularly within the context of climate crisis at the moment and the many economic challenges that are connected and are created by it as well. We find that perhaps one way of going forward is to account for four things. Firstly, that when we are looking at reparative justice, that there is a recognition that something has gone wrong. In our present context, where we have climate deniers or people who are trying to subvert the idea that there is actually a problem that we're having to face, recognition of the crisis, a discernment of what is going on is particularly important. But it's not just a discernment that we require. The second thing that we need to look at is a question of remorse. That we are sorry for what we have done to bring the earth and its people into this condition. And what are the reasons for this? The third thing we need to look at, apart from recognition and remorse, is repentance. That we need to have a metanoia, a turning around, a turning away from what we were and turning towards something completely different. And the fourth is reparation, that we must make up for what damage we have done. So tzedakah, in other words, would require us to have remorse. It would require us to have recognition, remorse, repentance, and reparation. But yet, in the present situation that we are in, what we recognize is that we are in the midst of an absolute catastrophe. Simply now looking towards either mispath or looking towards tzedakah is not enough. What we need is a complete overhaul of the system. And it is perhaps then the divine idea of justice that is found in Jesus's work on the cross in the act of atonement that speaks to us. Not only is atonement about creating right relationships, but atonement is a complete rehaul of the entire system of us thinking as well, where the divine being gives off the divine self in order to enable us to think completely differently about the system we are in. In such an imagination of an alternative world, we find it is the victim who sets the principles or the framework in which atonement must be created. It is God who is on the cross, the crucified God who sets the entire system or the framework in which atonement happens. The injured party does this. And this is the perspective of those who are wounded, through which we need to look at an entire system change. So that is the first part that I want to put forward. The second part is actually a biblical vision of taxation and doing this differently. Taxation affords us a certain possibility of doing things different in the present, but also under the larger horizon of a system change that lies in the future. And while my good friend David spoke very emphatically and powerfully about the Zacchaeus text, I would like to pull our attention now, turn our attention to another tax collector in the Bible that we are familiar with, and that is the person of Matthew. If you read through the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew, or Levi, is introduced to us as a tax collector, and his story of the call has something powerful to tell us about how justice can happen in our world today. If you look at the text begins with Matthew, who is the patron saint of bankers, actually, sitting down while Jesus comes to him. Matthew, we should question, therefore, who are we sitting with? Who are our partners in crime? With whom do our loyalties actually lie? Jesus commands Matthew to stand up and get out. Recognize the systems that we are in is not working, and we need to leave these systems. And that is what Matthew does. He leaves behind his job as a tax collector, stands up, and goes away. And the third thing, we find the scene shifts and Jesus is lying down. He's actually sitting down, but in those days reclining, along with tax collectors, sinners, people who belong to the underclass of society at that time. Again, those who are oppressed, those who are left out, those who are excluded will have a vision of an alternative society. Who are our bedfellows? Who are we lying down with? It is upon us now at this moment to make these very strange and unusual alliances with people's movements, social movements, those who are lying on the margins, with nation states that are drowning, to conceive of an alternative society itself. And perhaps this is what the ZacTax campaign is trying to do, drawing from this idea of Zacchaeus, that we try to conceive a system in which a way in which we can poke holes into the system by calling on a system of progressive taxation to tax the wealthy, the super wealthy in the world, to tax those who are polluting, and to use these taxations for the benefit of the climate and for people. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much to the organizers. I was happy to be here with you today.
Thank you very much, Philip, for those insights on what Tzedakah means in our context and who we want to lie down with. I thought that was great metaphor to have when it comes to talking about tax justice as well. Like, probably those people who are on the margins, people who are right now in need of those funds and reparations, they already know what they need. We just need to partner with them to see how we can provide them. Yes, thank you very much. Maybe you also saw that Athena has shared a link with us in the chat. Thank you very much, Athena. There you can have some more insights into what the ZacTax campaign is. There's also a toolkit there and a video that explains a bit more in depth about the Zacchaeus tax and how that might be a way of how your church community can get involved into that kind of topic. So we're going to start the Q&A section. Thank you very much. There have already been some questions put into the Q&A section or into the chat. If you want to engage with any of the speakers, please just write down your questions into the Q&A section or into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. If it's a question that's addressed to one person and one of the responses or presentations in general, please put that in there as well. Otherwise, we'll just see who can answer to that question. The first question that came from Uhuru Dempers. He asked, what can faith leaders and civil society organizations do locally and regionally to support the negotiation processes in New York the coming few years for a legally binding UN tax convention? Maybe Chennai, can you address that question first? And then maybe Philip, you can add some things from the Zacchaeus tax campaign on how we can get more involved in that.
Sorry, Sarah, would you mind repeating that question? I'm happy to answer.
Yes, of course. It's also in the Q&A section, the first one. What can faith leaders and civil society organizations do locally and regionally to support the negotiation processes in New York the coming few years for a legally binding UN tax convention?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My response to that is a lot. So I think, when I gave my remarks, I was really sort of talking to what's going on in New York and a lot of the progress that we're seeing, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. The conversations are going to start getting very technical at this moment. And so because of that, our delegates in New York who are spearheading this process are going to start to need a lot more support, particularly from the technical expertise at Capitol, number one, and then number two, political support as well. I think they need to see that their heads of state and very sort of high-level policymakers in our respective countries are supporting that process. The reason for the technical expertise is because, as you can imagine, the delegates in New York are dealing with a whole host of different issues. And so the UN Tax Convention is one. And so they don't have, I guess, to some degree, the level of depth that's required because they're spread so thin, particularly, from developing countries. So I would say there's a need for civil society as well as faith-based organizations, to really start to appeal specifically to ministries of finance and revenue authorities to take an interest in that work, right? Because they need that support. And then the second point I'd made about the need for political champions, political support, is because what we are trying to do now is really sort of change decades, an almost century old way of governance, right? That is skewed in the favor of rich countries, that is skewed in the favor of multinational corporations. That's how they were able to shift, right? And the minute you start playing around with that, you're really pushing back against power, right? You're pushing back against very serious interests, right? And so technical people, whilst they're very good with working on the details that's required to realign that, really need the support, the backing of high-level individuals from our respective countries, right? So I would say that whilst the conversations are happening with ministries of finance, insofar as it's possible, if you have access to your heads of state, right, we need to see African governments, African presidents really in support. And I think that's a really great space that I think particularly faith-based organizations, just because of the power they hold in many of our countries, can really sort of contribute as an entry point as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much on elaborating that and making us aware of how we can get involved. Philip, do you also have some insight from the Zacchaeus campaign on how you plan to get involved, how you already got involved with the UN Tax Convention specifically, or with other campaigns in that area, and what were kind of some of the best practices that you saw during this work?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So with the Zacchaeus tax campaign itself, we try to address the question of taxes and just taxation at two specific levels. One is we want to work with our churches, our member churches in particular, to offer education on the question of economic justice and how taxation, just taxation, can actually address the questions of economic injustice and perhaps find the very necessary funding for questions like health, education, gender, empowerment, these kind of very specific, crucial areas of human development that we need to invest in. So that's the one level that we want to do. So education at the level of churches. But the second level that we work at is working with the UN, at the UN level and international financial organizations, to ensure that there is a binding global system of just taxation that is also put into place. Now, with the second question, we are doing advocacy work through our UN mechanisms of the respective organizations, but also together, we ensure that we are regularly, advocating along with the G20 to see that such systems are put into place. But moreover, we are part of not just taxation groups and social movements that are pushing towards this, but there is an ecumenical coalition that has been COP, so to speak, that has been working towards lobbying and advocating towards this very specific UN convention on just taxation that has been developing. And we are very much at the table with this and looking to see how we can go further. But I want to address the specific part that was asked by Uhuru, what can actually churches do? So I think the first thing that churches should do is study what is your tax mechanism in your particular location. Secondly, we need to look at where is our tax money being spent. All governments collect taxes, but a lot of this tax is going to service debt, illegitimate debt that many third world countries have been pushed into, or secondly, for military expenses. Most of all, we find that because of structural adjustment programs put into place by financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF, there has been a serious cutback on public welfare spending, and several things which should be actually socialized and available for everyone are increasingly being privatized and monetized at the cost of the public goods. And this is something that we must resist. And this happens at the local level itself. So I think there is much work for our congregations and our churches to do at the very local level.
Thank you very much for reminding us of making sure that we also look into our responsibility on the local level, and then also have that advocacy, but as well as that education level on there. I think this webinar as well is something that can contribute, right, to that education level. So we're gonna see that we can put a recording of that webinar online as well after this afternoon, morning, evening. So you can have that as a resource as well when it comes to educate people on the topic of tax justice, educate people within your churches, on the local political level, whatever it is. So make sure that there are many good resources out there already, also with the different tax justice networks that work locally or within different continents as well. Towards the different tax justice networks, we also had a question in the Q&A from Sarah Hall. She also linked us some resources for people in the UK on how they can get involved with emailing their local MPs there. Sarah also had a question for Chennai. Do you see an opportunity for Tax Justice Africa to work with a group of UK civil society organization in the UK to lobby their government on the convention, or is this not a good use of time and resources for Tax Justice Africa? Maybe just to broaden on that, Chennai, with the different tax justice networks, I know there are other continents that are involved as well. What were your experiences? How do you work with the context outside of Africa? Are you very much involved in your continent or in other continents as well? How does that kind of network, those connections, how do they work?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Sarah. I think that's a really great question. So maybe just to take a step back, there is a regional network similar to TJNA that exists in, I would say, almost every single region, right? So in Latin America, our counterparts there are Red de Justicia Fiscal. In Asia, APMDD. In America, Fact Coalition. And then in Europe, maybe now to sort of speak to the last questions, our colleagues at Eurodad are doing incredible work there. And what I want to flag is that actually that is where the most work needs to happen. The process on the UN Tax Convention, as I mentioned earlier, is being spearheaded by the Africa Group. So for civil society and the church and other faith-based organizations that are working in Africa, the work there really is awareness raising, is really generation of political will to support that process. However, the general direction with regards to the UN Tax Convention is positive, and our delegates, particularly in the New York, as well as the Africa Union and colleagues such as Africa Tax Administration Forum, are all agreed and in consensus promoting that work. If you've been following the conversations in New York, you'll note that other global South countries are also allying themselves with the Africa Group. And so often you'll find that a number of Latin American countries and Asian countries, you know, if the Africa Group has said something, often they're saying we align ourselves with the statements made by that region. Where we need to do most work is specifically in Europe as well as in the United States. So when it came to the voting at the end of this year for the terms of reference, the US actually explicitly said, we don't support this process and flagged its reasons. But these were all reasons that, you know, a lot of global South countries had pushed back against, right? Because many of the reasons were symptomatic of our current global system, right? Which is why it's not working as well, right? Having said that, if you take a look and sort of assess the way in which countries voted, you'll note that most of the countries that either voted against or abstained were countries from Europe, right? So the UK was a big one. I actually think that they abstained, and then some of the other Western European countries. The UK voted against, and some of the others abstained. So the work actually really needs to be done in Europe, right? In the global north. That's where the convincing needs to take place. I would say first port of call would be to engage with Eurodad, who are the European version of us. But whenever requested, we're always happy to give an African perspective. If, say, you organize something and you'd like, you know, one of us or from another global South region to give our reflections on what the impact of that, of their decision-making is having in other regions, we're always happy to do that.
Yeah, I really like that, to have like, we need to also on the European levels. I count myself as this because I'm from Switzerland. So I think we need to do a lot of work when it comes to tax justice, but then also, look into other contexts, because this is where we can gather some more of that insights into the implications, right,
Yes.
of what we are doing right now. So thank you very much for reminding us of that. Let's do a little bit of a shift when it comes to the questions. I have a theological questions for David, who came in through the chat. This is a question that came in. It is your understanding of salvation as food on the table, peace, etc., meant to include only these pragmatic elements, or are these coming as an addition to its more conventional eschatological meaning? In other words, is salvation only food on the table, peace, etc., or is it also food on the table, peace, etc.? Can you speak some more to that, David?
Yes. Well, thanks for this question. It's a very important question because sometimes we confuse this kind of things. So no, definitely include both. But the issue here is that we usually put the accent in the first one, I mean, in the spiritual side of it. And when I say spiritual, it's not because food on the table is not spiritual. It's because sometimes we focus very much on this afterlife or this eschatological meaning of salvation. And salvation have a lot to do with that, but also a lot to do with like a more pragmatical, more right now and today stuff. So yeah, it's both. And this is key for understanding that there is different ways to understand the relationship between economics and theology. And one of those ways is opposing them and say theology doesn't have anything to do with economics. So theology actually is like the judge of economics, saying what to do, or what is wrong or what is right. But sometimes we need to acknowledge that our Bible, our text, is full of this entangled between the two things when each other is actually co-constitutive and speak about each other. So this notion of embedding salvation from both elements, spiritual and not spiritual. But by the way, food is spiritual in many ways. So when you go to different cultures, etc., just when you are eating, you are feeding your body, it's a spiritual action. So so there is not this dichotomy between one or the other. It's just the accent with food when we are dealing with these two. So the call here is, yes, we have to recognize that this is both, but at the same time recognize that the relationship between economics and theology is not this opposing relationship. Yeah, we have something to say from the theological standpoint, but at the same time, we are very much in relation with the economic principles. So that's why I'm saying that we are in some point complicit with the system where we are in, and we need to recognize our responsibility as part of it. Yeah.
Thank you very much for expanding on that. And yeah, I also think food is very much spiritual, so it should not be too much only looked at from the other lens. Thank you. I have another few questions for Chennai. You see that your keynote has very much engaged with people. There are two questions that go into the area of governance. There's one question of Tukumbi Lumumba Kazango, which is, would you expand on the system of governance? How can the poor people and those who are affected get involved themselves using the democratic tools and arenas to voice the issues of taxing? And then maybe also related to that, so you can maybe treat them together, from David Ugolor, will a shifting tax treaty negotiation to UN resolve power issues, which resolve the power issue, which is largely responsible for the problem of the developing countries? How do we deal with the challenge of governance issues in African countries?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, I think both of those are really, both of them are really good questions.
Okay, now she cut out. So maybe let's do one of the follow-up questions that came from David. Maybe to Philip, David, as well as Patricia, because you're all coming from like a church background. There was a question on how to get Africa Pentecostal churches to participate in social justice campaigns because of the increasing prosperity gospel that is being taught as a challenge. I think we can not only look at this from African Pentecostal churches, but in general, the whole prosperity gospel as a challenge for when it comes to economic justice questions. How can we deal with that? How can we address that? I don't know if one of you or maybe two of you want to address that topic.
Philip, you want to?
Okay, I think let Patrice go for this first, actually.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Sarah has made a good point that it's not only happening in Africa, it's also happening in the Philippines and everywhere. That's what the ecumenical community is facing right now. And we're also asking that ourselves. How could we get the young people and everyone for that matter to talk more about social justice inside our churches and within our faith communities? And one answer that I hear a lot from our pastors and from our church leaders is for the church to get in touch again and always with what is happening in the grassroots level, to also minister to the realities that are facing by the communities, because we believe that the people going to prosperity gospel and such are their reaction to the crisis that they are feeling in the community that surrounds them. So the church now also has a choice to make, has a decision to make. Are we going that direction, or are we also addressing life here on earth, the kingdom here on earth as well? So it starts with getting back to our communities, asking them what they need, administering to their needs, and really getting to the roots of their needs and the crisis that they are feeling. And it starts with the discussion. It starts with getting back to them at the grassroots level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is very important. Thank you for highlighting that we have to actually minister to the reality of people and to the community of people, and not just what we would like the community and the reality to be. So thank you for reminding us. Chennai, you're back. Let's see. Can we hear you? Can you give us a little
I hope so. Can you hear me? Okay.
Perfect. Do you want to answer to the question regarding the government?
I can, and I'll be quick as well, in case I drop off again. So yeah, I'm going to start with tax, and then I'm going to sort of broaden it out to the broader economic governance question, right? So right now, what we're seeing, particularly within the tax justice stream of economic justice as a whole, is an opportunity to create a global tax system that actually prioritizes the needs of the vulnerable, of marginalized, over the interests of the powerful, right? And the way that's happening is by our effort to try and rewrite the rules, right? So that they serve everybody rather than just a privileged few, right? And so, of course, this is at the global level. And so what we're seeing is that by trying to create a system that puts everybody at a level playing field, allows everybody to contribute, and allows everybody to have the same weight in conversation. That should help us arrive at a solution that is much more equitable, that is much more cognizant of the different needs and contexts of everybody, right? Because right now that's not what we have, right? And so because of that, we have a system that really sort of prioritizes the few. And right now, for those of you who've been sort of following this conversation broadly, you'll note that there's actually a broader recognition, right, that the global economic governance as a whole is not fit for purpose. And these statements are coming from as high as the Secretary General of the United Nations, right? And we're starting to see these conversations permeate even within international financial institutions, right? The World Bank and the IMF. But these are the institutions, I mean, if you follow closely, you'll note that their interpretation of, okay, how do we make much more equitable these institutions is very different from what we're saying, right? I think for us, we're saying our system needs an overhaul, one that prioritizes people and planet, right? One that prioritizes equity and justice. And the foundations, unfortunately, of our current system are not that, right? And so in order to get us to where we need to be, we need to think radically. And the radical is not impossible, right? Like I said, it's what we're seeing happen within the global tax system. And if it can happen in one stream of work, we can see it happen across various others. And already you're starting to see rumblings with our colleagues who work in the debt justice movement, right? They're saying the rules and the way they're being made here disadvantage us, right? You're seeing this happen in the public health space. You're seeing this happen in the trade space. And so that's sort of just the broader, when I talk about economic governance, right, I hope that gives you a little bit of insight in terms of what I'm alluding to. Having said that, I think there was a question around how to hold our leaders to account at the national level. So these are two different conversations, but important because they intersect, right? You can't divorce them. But the principles remain the same. And the reason I say this is because you're starting to see particularly the most marginalized countries in the global community start to call the most powerful countries to account, right? Say the global system doesn't work for us. We need one that prioritizes people and planet. You're also starting to see the same thing at the national level, right? And not just in Africa. I mean, although I can cite a whole host of different examples in Africa where you're starting to see the citizens, right, and civil society hold their leaders to account, right? It's the same thing happening at a different level, but essentially for me is contributing to the same outcome, right? And so the reason I say this is because whilst separate, they are connected, but we do need to understand how the different entry points, right, into the different conversations. So when I was talking about the role of civil society earlier within the global conversation, here there's an almost working together with governments that we need to do, right, to correct for what's happening here. However, that does not preclude the work we still need to do at national level, right, to hold our governments to account. So I hope that makes sense a little bit with regard to the broader conversations around much more people-centered governance.
Yeah, and I think you addressed a very important issue that there's not just one way to engage. There are many different ways to engage. There are many different kind of points where we can start pushing for it. And it may depend on our context, on our churches, on where we can start with that. And we can all see there are some questions that we are going to have to leave unanswered as we're coming to the end of this webinar. But there's something I just want to, one resource that I just want to share with all of us today. I invite you just to take a few moments in silence to breathe, to pray, to lift up not only the hopes that we've heard today, but also the struggles. And I'm just going to say a few words of prayer for us at the end of this, because this is also a resource that we share. And this is one of the pushing points we can engage with. So I invite you to have a moment of silence and prayer. God, you see our struggles. You sustain our hopes. Make us fearless and strong in the face of adversity. Be with us and connect us all. Amen. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening in, for asking your questions, for engaging with us on this important topic. The work has just started. It's not at the end, we're not there yet, but we can use as many hands as possible when it comes to, getting one step closer towards that global justice that we all need so dearly. If you are interested in general in that topic of how economic issues impact our global and climate justice, the working group Economy of Life of the Commission on Climate Justice and Sustainable Development of the WCC, which also conceptualized this webinar, is working on other such webinars who highlight the intersection between economic and climate issues. So if you want to stay updated on that, on when the next webinar on that is going to come out, I think the easiest way is just to follow WCC on their social media channels, and we'll keep you updated on those webinars. Thank you very much also to the communications team for making this webinar possible, as well as Athena Peralta and Uhuru Dempers, who were together with me the organizers for this webinar. Thank you both very much. Thank you also to our amazing panelists. Thank you for taking your time, for sharing your insights, for sharing where you struggle, but also where you hope, and for connecting us all together. Now, the only thing that is left for me to wish you all a very blessed morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. May God help us to be warriors for justice in this world. Have a good day. See you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.